Welcome to the deep dive. You know, we often see science presented with this real sense of wonder. Think about those amazing nature shows or headlines screaming about the next big cure. Well, today we're really digging into that, the way science gets, well, romanticized and how it's communicated.
Exactly. Yeah, we've gathered some really interesting sources that look at this, and it's definitely a double-edged sword.
Right.
On one hand, yeah, it's a super powerful way to connect with people, grab their interest, but on the other, there are some potential downsides we probably need to think about, seriously think about.
So our mission today is to get past just noticing that science often comes wrapped in awe. We want to explore how that actually works and, what it all means. So when we say romanticizing scientific observation, what are we really talking about? It's got to be more than just, hey, science is cool, right?
Oh, absolutely. It's about intentionally weaving in feelings of awe, wonder, using narrative, emotional connection when talking about the process, the findings, everything. It's about making science into a compelling story for people who aren't necessarily experts.
Gotcha. And our sources mention someone, Gaston Lopez, who actually calls himself a romantic of science. He apparently finds incredible wonder in just the details, like how a seed sprouts.
Yeah, exactly. For him, the awe isn't some magic thing. It's in the explanation. Understanding the mechanics, that's what's amazing.
Right. Finding the marvel in the understanding itself.
Precisely. But that immediately raises a question, doesn't it? There's this tension. How do you balance making science inspiring and exciting for the public with the need for, scientific accuracy? And being honest about what we don't know, the uncertainty.
Absolutely. And that's the core issue here, the main thing our sources dig into. Romanticizing science, it's powerful, but it cuts both ways.
Yeah.
It can be fantastic for sparking curiosity, making things memorable, helping people learn. But it also risks creating misunderstandings, setting up unrealistic expectations, maybe even damaging trust in the long run. So let's start with the good stuff. How does using awe actually help science?
Well, one big thing is just grabbing attention, igniting people's imagination. When science feels exciting, relevant, maybe even moving, it makes people genuinely want to know more. Remember Lopez's little victories of understanding?
Yeah.
That feeling of awe you get. That's a powerful motivator for engagement.
It's that wow factor, isn't it, that really clicks. And the research we looked at suggests these emotions, curiosity, awe, they're not just fluff, they're actually key for building engagement, even trust.
Exactly right. Trust isn't just about facts, it's emotional connection, feeling like you get it on some level. Awe, especially, seems to be used deliberately in science communication. And studies show it really does boost interest in the science itself. Makes you lean in.
Our sources called it a kind of cognitive hook. That first emotional spark pulls you into deeper thinking. It's almost like that whole romanticize your life trend.
Oh, yeah.
Finding wonder in the everyday. Popular science kind of does that, pushing us to see the extraordinary things we might take for granted.
And another huge benefit is bridging that gap
Yeah.
between complex science and everyone else. Storytelling, analogies, metaphors, they're crucial tools here.
Right. Like explaining a cell process by comparing it to a factory. Makes it click.
Totally.
Yeah.
Robert Krulwich, the science journalist, he apparently tells scientists, embrace metaphors. Tell the stories behind the science, the struggles, the aha moments, the people.
Makes it human, less abstract.
Absolutely. Narrative can turn these abstract principles into something you can actually picture. Easier to grasp, easier to remember. Carl Sagan was brilliant at this.
That's definitely.
Always stressing simple language, remembering what it felt like to not know something yet. It's not about dumbing down, it's about access, making complex ideas reachable.
And then there's the impact on the next generation. That's huge. Inspiring portrayals of science, of scientists, that can really push young people towards STEM fields.
Yeah, we talk about the leaky STEM pipeline, right? This kind of positive framing can help plug some of those leaks. Keep students interested. Storytelling can spark that curiosity, that wonder, that excitement, things that are just so vital for getting kids hooked and keeping them hooked.
And the sources really stress the power of human stories, role models, especially for underrepresented groups.
Oh, absolutely critical. Seeing someone who looks like you succeeding in science, that sends a powerful message. Makes it feel possible, like, hey, I could do that too.
Exactly. And the research suggests that if we consciously create diverse, inspiring, romanticized stories, well, that could be a real tool for promoting equity in STEM. Makes perfect sense. If the heroes are diverse, more kids see themselves reflected.
And finally, there's the societal value bet.
Yeah.
A public that's engaged, inspired, they're just more likely to see science as valuable, worth supporting.
Through funding, policies,
Right.
just general appreciation.
Right. Remember Gaston Lopez's worry about the disconnect between art, culture, and the sciences?
Yeah.
Well, these more romanticized approaches can help bridge that. They align with goals like broadening participation, improving understanding, basically making science feel less intimidating, more welcoming.
So people see the value, they're more likely to back it.
Exactly. And humanizing scientists through stories builds trust, too. Makes the whole thing seem less ivory tower, you know.
Okay, so that's a pretty compelling case for the upside. Inspiring people, making connections, building support. But let's turn to the other side now, the potential problems. When does the dazzle become, well, damaging?
Yeah, this is where it gets tricky. That same desire to create wonder can slide into sensationalism. Findings get exaggerated, implications get blown way out of proportion. Every small step gets hailed as a revolution.
Right.
And some sources even hinted that sometimes maybe the popularizer is looking for a bit of fame, not just education.
It's the hype factor. The research defined it as, like, overly optimistic claims, maybe not fully backed by the evidence yet. And we see a lot of that, don't we?
We really do. Media outlets are under pressure for news, right? So headlines often sensationalize things, even when the actual science is way more nuanced or just preliminary. And then there's what the sources call the breakthrough fallacy. This constant need to frame everything as a game changer. It misrepresents how science usually works, slow, steady, building on itself.
And that leads to unrealistic expectations. People get impatient.
Exactly. Impatient when science doesn't deliver instant fixes. It creates a lack of appreciation for the rigorous, often slow process.
And the Google quantum ship example in our sources really highlights this, doesn't it? The whole multiverse narrative that spun out of it, that definitely got people talking.
Oh, it absolutely did. Claims of shattered expectations, doing the impossible, even hints that it was like evidence for parallel universe.
Wow.
And comparing its speed on specific tasks to classical computers, saying it would take longer than the age of the universe. That sounds incredible, but the context is crucial.
Because the scientific community's reaction was a bit more measured.
You could say that. Many experts saw it, at least partly, as tech marketing. Companies need to generate buzz, right?
Sure.
Alan Woodward, a computer scientist, called it a major milestone in error correction, which is important for quantum computers. But he also stressed, practical uses are still a long way off.
Okay.
And the speed comparisons. They were criticized for being based on problems basically designed to make the quantum chip look good, not necessarily representative of general computing power.
And the multiverse link, that seemed like the really romantic part.
It totally was, but scientifically. Pretty tenuous. The many worlds interpretation is just one way to think about quantum mechanics. There are other interpretations that work just as well mathematically without needing infinite universes.
Right.
And our sources note this isn't the first time quantum computing has seen this kind of maybe overly enthusiastic reporting. There was the quantum supremacy claim in 2019, the wormhole simulation in 2022.
So it really blurs that line, doesn't it, between real scientific progress and, well, science fiction almost. The pull of these big, exciting stories can kind of obscure the actual incremental work.
That's a perfect way to put it. And there's a great table in the sources that lays it out clearly. Here's the claim, here's the romanticized spin, and here's the more sober scientific counterpoint. Like, progress on error correction becomes proof of the multiverse, or speed on one specific task becomes solving impossible problems. It shows how easily real advances get tangled up in these much grander, maybe less accurate narratives.
Yeah, and economic pressures push this along. Media needing clicks, institutions needing funding.
Yeah, that definitely creates incentives for hype,
Right.
amplifies the romanticized angle.
Okay, so besides these big splashy claims, another danger you mentioned is oversimplification. Losing nuance in the effort to make things easy to understand.
Exactly. Simplification is necessary, obviously.
Yeah.
But if it's not done carefully, it can lead to people having a really shallow understanding, or worse, just getting it wrong. The material talks about this paradox of scientific storytelling. Engaging stories are great, but they can be unscientific if they focus too much on one specific case instead of the whole picture, the uncertainties.
You lose the caveats, the fact that findings are often probabilistic, that research is this back and forth process.
Precisely. Think about public health advice during, say, a pandemic. It evolves as we learn more.
Right.
But if the initial messages were presented as totally definitive, without mentioning uncertainty, people get confused, even distrustful when the advice changes. It feels like science is flip-flopping.
Yeah, I can see that.
And even basic scientific words, fact, law, theory, they mean something specific in science, often different from everyday use. That distinction gets lost easily in simplified accounts.
And all this,
Yeah.
the hype, the oversimplification, it can feed into a really serious problem, eroding public trust.
That's a major concern. If people feel constantly bombarded with exaggerated claims or promises that don't pan out, they start to question science's credibility. Hype just fundamentally undermines the view of science as careful, evidence-based. When reality doesn't match the headlines, disappointment sets in and trust wears away.
And we are seeing some decline in public trust figures, aren't we?
We are. The reasons are complex, for sure. But this cycle of hype and potential disillusionment could definitely be part of that picture.
And losing trust has real consequences, right? People might ignore expert advice on important stuff.
Absolutely. The sources show that people who trust scientists more are generally more likely to, accept scientific findings and act accordingly. When trust goes down, skepticism can spread, sometimes even to the scientific method itself, especially if people feel manipulated or see what looks like random shifts in scientific consensus.
Okay, and one last downside mentioned, distorting the scientific landscape itself, the focus on sexy science.
Yeah, that overemphasis on the big breakthroughs can make people misunderstand what most research is actually, like incremental, detailed, maybe not headline grabbing.
Right, building blocks, not just finished castles.
Exactly. And there's a worry that the pressure to publish something novel and exciting in top journals, amplified by what the media likes to cover, might push research towards novelty over rigor, or devalue replication, foundational work.
And that could affect funding, especially for younger researchers.
Potentially, yeah.
Yeah.
If public support dips because of broken promises or hype fatigue, funding can become more uncertain. That's tough for anyone, but especially early career scientists.
The sources brought up Sabine Hossenfelder's critique here about mathematical fiction in physics.
Right. She's argued that some areas, particularly in fundamental physics, might be chasing theories that sound amazing but aren't really testable, potentially distorting research priorities and funding. It's definitely a controversial take, but it highlights this broader concern about overpromising and about how research priorities, driven partly by what seems exciting or romantic, get set.
And that strong public and media appetite for the romantic breakthrough, it can make the slow, essential groundwork seem less valuable.
It really can. Like only wanting to hear about the ribbon cutting for the skyscraper, not the years of careful engineering that made it stand up.
So we've seen the good and the bad, the potential benefits, the real risks. It really forces us to think about communicating science responsibly.
Absolutely. And at the core of that has to be, well, truthfulness, accuracy, and a sense of responsibility. To the audience, yes, but also to science itself. The material asks a really pointed question. What makes science communication good in a moral sense? Are there limits to how exciting or awe-inspiring we should try to make it?
Because maybe not everything needs to be presented in the most dramatic way possible, especially if there are potential negative consequences.
Precisely. So sticking to best practices is key. Things like minimizing jargon, actively avoiding sensationalism, trying to give balanced views, being upfront about limitations.
Sounds a lot like good journalism ethics, actually.
Very similar. Caution against hype, fairness, accuracy. Though complete neutrality is tricky, right? Even choosing what to study involves some bias. But the main goal has to be accuracy, impartiality, responsibility, not just engagement or wonder.
And that responsibility includes being clear about the process itself. The uncertainties, the debates, the limitations, things that often get smoothed over in romanticized versions.
Exactly. Those are crucial parts of how science actually works. Glossing over them does a disservice.
Which brings us back to that storytelling paradox you mentioned earlier. How do you use stories to engage people without messing up the accuracy or promoting unscientific thinking?
Yeah, it's tough. Narrative thinking often looks for coherence, a satisfying story arc, emotional resonance. Whereas scientific thinking prioritizes evidence, considers a range of possibilities, deals with probabilities.
So the risk is that people start judging science based on how good the story sounds, not how good the evidence is.
That's the worry. Now, people are trying to navigate this. Randy Olson talks about finding a balance, being engaging but accurate. Krulwich emphasizes metaphors, but also showing the hard work behind the knowledge.
Right.
But concerns remain. Subjectivity creeping in, blurring lines with fiction, narrative being persuasive even without strong evidence, and the potential for anti-science groups to hijack compelling but misleading narratives.
So what's the answer? Responsible storytelling.
That seems to be the idea. Clearly marking speculation versus fact, weaving uncertainty into the narrative, using the story to actually shed light on the scientific process itself, warts and all.
And we also need to think about the different kinds of knowledge, right? How science creates knowledge versus how it's often portrayed.
Absolutely fundamental difference. Scientific knowledge is usually probabilistic. It's provisional, open to change with new evidence. It goes through peer review. It aims to be falsifiable.
Whereas the popular accounts can make it sound certain, definitive, driven by lone geniuses having eureka moments.
Exactly. And even words like fact or law mean specific things in science, different from everyday talk. That gap can cause real misunderstanding about what science is and what it can claim.
And the sources mentioned that romanticizing can sometimes give scientific ideas a kind of philosophical or emotional certainty they don't actually warrant.
Yeah, that's a subtle but important point. Take the many worlds interpretation in quantum physics again. It's mathematically interesting, elegant even, but it's incredibly difficult, maybe impossible, to test empirically. So presenting it as the truth about reality, some philosophers of science argue that crosses a line into speculation, maybe even pseudoscience.
So responsible popularization needs to educate people about the nature of science, too, how it works, its limits.
Precisely. It's not just about the what, it's about the how and how sure are we.
Looking at some famous communicators might give us clues, too. Carl Sagan, for instance.
A masterclass, really. He conveyed incredible wonder, but always stressed critical thinking, skepticism, the scientific method. And he saw communication as vital, a responsibility. His call for scientists to tithe time for outreach was huge. But it also makes you think, how do we train scientists for that effectively? And how do we stop the outreach itself from becoming too romanticized, detached from the messy reality?
Good point. Then there's Neil deGrasse Tyson. He often talks about science as a journey, full of uncertainty, always open to revision.
Yeah, emphasizing the process. Though he's also faced critiques sometimes about perhaps overstating the role of pure evidence-based thinking in complex societal or ethical issues.
And Sabine Hassenfelder, bringing that critical perspective on hype, especially in physics.
Right. Questioning research funding priorities, how theoretical ideas are sold to the public. Her language can be provocative, sure, but she forces a conversation about integrity, about the link between how research is funded and conducted and how it gets communicated. If a research priorities get skewed by hype, the popular narratives will likely follow.
So wrapping this all up, it's clear that romanticizing science is, well, complicated. It's got this real potential for good, but also some serious pitfalls if we're not careful.
Exactly. Powerful tool for inspiration and learning, definitely. But also risks misleading, creating unrealistic hopes. Real scientific literacy isn't just knowing facts. It's understanding how science works, its strengths, its limitations, how knowledge gets built and revised.
So we should aim for, what did you call it? A critically engaged appreciation.
Yeah, something like that. Appreciate the wonder, absolutely. But keep the critical thinking switched on. Maintain a healthy skepticism.
So what are the practical steps? How do we encourage more responsible science communication?
Well, the sources suggest several things. Clear, transparent communication is key. Being upfront about uncertainties.
Okay.
Actively working to boost scientific literacy in general.
Okay.
And encouraging more genuine dialogue between scientists and the public.
And that means specific things for different groups.
Right. For scientists, get communication training. Be cautious about hype in your own work. Maybe collaborate more with skilled communicators. Be transparent. For communicators, accuracy above all. Provide context. Use multiple sources. Explain the process. Practice that responsible storytelling we talked about. Be aware of hype cycles.
And for us, the public.
Cultivate critical thinking. Seek out diverse sources. Try to understand science as a process, not just results. And yeah, enjoy the wonder, but do it with awareness.
It's interesting to think, too, that maybe some of the decline in trust isn't just external factors. Maybe it's partly linked to how science itself communicates, those internal hype cycles.
That's a really crucial point to consider.
Yeah.
Ultimately, though, science communicated well with clarity, with integrity is just invaluable for society. We need informed citizens. The challenge is using that power of romanticism wisely, to illuminate understanding, not obscure it, to foster appreciation that's both inspired and discerning.
Well, that's all the time we have for this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.